The American Revolution Events That Led to the Rebellion by Hannah Lawrence, Monica Rodriguez, Analisse Panetta, Milfred Stevens, and Amahri Turner.
Why do people rebel? Looking back at the American Revolution, you truly see the core of colonist America and what America has always been represented as. The American Revolution was a pivotal moment in which you can now see the essence and becoming of our judicial system and way of life today. A place where new thoughts and ways of life are explored by freedom, not diminished. The colonists had hope, and that's what really caused rebellion. The idea that the colonists knew they could do better and have a brighter future. Rebellion shows persistence for a desired future. Although rebellion might not be necessary, it brings in the principle in which a person believes they deserve better and see a brighter future. American civilians or patriots no longer saw a bright future with England hand in hand. Most colonists understood that Britain only saw them as a resource, not as a citizen or the comrade. Rebellion for the colonists was a step forward, a piece of hope and future rebels once sought. When people rebel, it is simply human nature to seek and dream of desired and hopeful futures. For example, it's normal for a teenager to rebel against their parents, no longer wishing for a chain of restrictions that come with the ruler. The same was for the colonists. Why be a subject under the British rule when you could be a seemingly preeminent ruler to your own? The British crown could not fathom colonist issues which were different from Britain's. This excluded colonists that began seeing themselves different from a British citizen. Their desperateness resulted in a new hope for a better government, and it became clear who would be a paragon leader for their bundle of unique colonies, one of their own that understood struggle under British rule. The colonists wanted to feel that they belonged in a country, a part of something bigger, and as British colonists, they couldn't feel this way, with your ruler 3,000 miles away essentially only paying attention to you if you caused trouble, which meant not paying taxes, treason, etc., and you not being considered a citizen, only a resource vessel. The colonists hoped for something more, which essentially started the American Revolution, including the following events.
The Stamp Act was introduced by R.T. Hahn, George Grenville. The Stamp Act of the British Parliament in 1756 that exacted revenue from the American colonies by imposing a stamp duty on newspapers and legal and commercial documents. Colonial opposition led to the acts in 1766 and helped encourage the revolutionary movement against the British crown. Money was not what made the colonists angry. What made the colonists mad was the Parliament passing taxes without the colonies' representation. On the issue, knowing that the British Parliament passed these taxes without the colonists' acknowledgement, excluding them from their Englishman rights. The colonists' acknowledgement excluding from their Englishman rights. The reason that made the colonists want to rebel was because in 1765 the harsh British imposed the first tax against the American people. The Stamp Act was really unfair because not only did it demand more than most people were able to afford, but it was also made by a government where the American people had no representation. Under this tax, every legal and commercial document also included articles such as newspapers, pamphlets, were subject to tax. No taxation without representation, which became the colonists' outcry. Didn't want to use tax paper and began a campaign of petition, writing and spread of boycotting of British. The Stamp Act was necessary for the American Revolution because it made colonists different from British citizens. They no longer weren't unified, but separated. The separation and difference between colonists and British citizens will soon be the becoming of the idea that rebellion is necessary if colonists wanted to be equal, which was not going to happen under the British Crown.
The trial of John Peter Zenger in August of 1735 helped establish one of our most important constitutional rights of freedom of the press. When Peter moved to New York from Germany, he found a job that was to be an apprentice to a printer. He was apprenticed for 8 years. At the age of 21, Peter was finally free to go out on his own, and he did. William Bradford was another author and had his own newspaper called the New York Gazette. This newspaper only said what the English governor wanted said. The King's governor, William Cosby, was a very rotten and mean mean governor. So two important lawyers urged Peter to make his own newspaper that would criticize the governor and his politics. It was called the New York Weekly and had very juicy stories saying how Governor Cosby took bribes and took away people's land. Peter just wanted the people to hear both sides of the story. Governor Cosby was furious and wanted the paper to stop publication, but Peter refused and was arrested and sent to jail. That didn't stop the paper from being published. His wife, the new publisher, and Peter stayed in jail for 10 months. A trial date was set. Peter was assigned with a young lawyer with very little experience. The attorney general said Zenger was guilty of libel. Libel is when you publish something you know is a lie that lie hurts a person. His lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, pleaded for Zenger's release, and in less than 10 minutes the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty. Now you may ask, what does this have to do with the American Revolution? The Boston Tea Party was one of the main components that sparked rebellion in the minds of colonists at the blooming time of the American Revolution. The Sons of Liberty, which were responsible for the Boston Tea Party, were an example that if patriots grouped together, they could take a stand against Britain. Samuel Adams was in charge of the Boston Tea Party and organized for the Sons of Liberty to be disguised as Native Americans, which of course didn't fool anyone. The Boston Tea Party was a patriotic outcry on the newly passed taxes by the British Parliament, causing the taxation without representation movement. Colonists believed that Britain was being unfair by taxing them for the French and Indian War. The Boston Tea Party influenced the American Revolution by attacking the merchant ships and dumping British tea, which cost Britain $1,700,000, wasted all on British tea. You can imagine how infuriated King George III was. After the Boston Tea Party, the British shut down the Boston Harbor until the 350 gallons of tea that were overboard was paid for again. The closing of the Boston Harbor cost many people of Boston their jobs. Since Boston's economy mostly revolved around fishing, etc., this caused another ripple of events against Britain.
The Boston Massacre was an event that shook up the colonies' view on Britain and what rebelling means to the colonies. Many colonies stayed neutral through all Boston and Britain disputes, but the Boston Massacre demanded views and sides to be changed. The Boston Massacre took place on the 5th of March in 1770 in Boston, a city plagued with many outbursts between the British government. It started out as an attack from a rowdy crowd of Bostonians forming around a station of British soldiers. The rioters were throwing slurs, rocks, and snow, demanding that all of Boston. These rioters were protesting the fact that British soldiers were occupying their city to reinforce the new imposing Townshend Acts. Not only did the new reinforcement of these taxes that were passed without the colonists' representation cause tension, but the population of British soldiers grew immensely in Boston, which only threw fuel into Bostonians' anger towards British soldiers. British soldiers called backup, sensing that the riots were only going to get bigger and bigger. Even after they tried to scare the rioters off with threats and warnings, it was getting heated for the British soldiers, and they were cracking under pressure. The soldiers were ready to shoot with their muskets hand in hand. Finally, one soldier shot into the crowd, causing following shots to be fired, killing 5 people and wounding 6 other Bostonians. After the shootings, the crowd dispersed, leaving behind the remains of the dead. The riots were gone, but a new riot was about to begin, and all the colonists' anger, once again, were on the British soldiers. The British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre were put on trial. It was obvious that it would not be a fair trial, knowing that all colonists felt that the soldiers' actions were a sign of war. All eyes were on the fate of the British soldiers. Fortunately enough for the British soldiers, John Adams, a well-known patriot and future founding father, stood at their defense as their lawyer, believing firmly in his words that, without human rights, the patriot cause is not worth fighting, even if he would be going against his fellow patriots that wanted to see the soldiers jailed, especially after all the controversy that followed the Boston Massacre, including an image created by Paul Revere, one of the Sons of Liberty, that arrayed his version of what went down the day of the infamous Boston Massacre. He dubbed it as the Bloody Massacre, showing the British soldiers opening fire to the crowd on orders, which wasn't what occurred. The Boston Massacre wasn't something that was ordered. This was the last thing Britain wanted. There was already a lot of tension and notion of rebellion going on the colonies. The Boston Massacre forced colonists to become opinionated on these issues and choose a side. The tension was no longer ignorable. It had to be confronted, and the American Revolution was just that. You can see the engraving created by Paul Revere was exaggerated, but even if the image's outcry was debatable, the colonists' anger towards the British was in no doubt. Many other colonists that had always seen Boston as savages that caused trouble and only brought down
The French and Indian War. In the 1750s, Britain and France were having a battle in Europe. But now the war was spreading in America because the British colonists wanted to take over the French land in North America and because the British wanted to take over the fur trade in the French-owned territory. On the day of November 1st, 1753, 21-year-old George Washington went to French Fort Duquesne with a message from Virginia's Governor Robert Dinwiddie to leave British territory or face the wrath of the British Empire. But the British didn't listen and threatened the French didn't listen and threatened the British in return. British territory or face the wrath of the British Empire. But the French didn't listen and threatened the British in return. The French and Indian War was caused because the colonists, without British permission, started lingering into French territories. They were warned multiple times to stop, but they did not heed the French soldiers' warnings and ventured into French territory. The French got angered and reclaimed their land after defeating the British in a merciless battle in the spring of July 9th, 1755, which claimed the life of British General Edward Braddock when he was severely shot. In the battle, George Washington almost lost his life as well, but he luckily survived, even though he earned multiple bullet holes in his jacket and in his hat. May have been bad, but the British were able to kill 12 French soldiers and wound 22 French soldiers. But of course, the French and Indian War's outcome was what really set fire to the colonists' anger and ideas of rebellion. After the French and Indian War, taxes were passed for the colonists to repay their debt to Britain. These actions seemed to array that the colonists were solely responsible for the commotion with the French. They felt pinned and deserted from their loyalist friends who did not have to pay these taxes. This caused a major rift in the relationship between the British and the colonists. On top of this, King George III created a proclamation in October 1763 forbidding all the colonist settlements to pass a line drawn out all along the Appalachian Mountains. He did this because the Native Americans were afraid that the colonists would drive them out of their homelands because of the colonists' new ideas of westward expansion. The colonists were angered by this because they felt like the British had snatched away their prize, which was the French territory, and they thought that this wasn't fair because that would mean that their war with the French was for no reason, and to them it made no sense for them to fight for this land. Answer me this. If you and your country fought a war, won the war, lost hundreds of sacred lives, some of them were your friends, and you are yet not able to use the prize of the war, which was the only purpose for the war, how would you feel? Also, on top of that, the people that were supporting you try to put the blame of the war on you and your country by taxing you for the expenses of the war. You would be outraged. This is how the colonists felt. Although these taxes were hardly burdensome, to their symbolism was enough to cause a riot.